Hello, and welcome to Old Ways in New Jersey. I'm Angus Kress Gillespie, your host. Previously on Old Ways in New Jersey, we've talked about traditional folk musicians from central New Jersey. We've talked about old houses dating back to the 18th century. But today, we're going to try something different. Our guest today is John Young. He's a U.S. Coast Guard veteran, and he has a very unusual hobby. As a teenager growing up in the South Bronx of New York, he took up the hobby of stamp collecting. Well, you might well ask, what's so unusual about that? The thing is that within the universe of stamp collecting, he specializes. He doesn't just collect stamps, he collects the whole envelope. In particular, he collects envelopes that have been sent from ships, mostly from U.S. Coast Guard ships. So it's my pleasure to welcome John Young to our studio today. What an interesting hobby you have, John. Let's just start with some basic questions. What is a Coast Guard cover?
Coast Guard covers a piece of mail that was either went through a Coast Guard unit or to a Coast Guard unit. It basically it's collectible because of its cachet or its postmark or sometimes to whom it is addressed to.
Okay, as a follow-up question, an obvious thing, what is a postmark?
Postmark is a cancel. It's the postal cancel that the date the piece of mail was mailed.
And what can you gather from that?
Yeah, you could gather, well, basically what city it was. Sometimes the postmark might appear on the back, like during the 1930s. Yeah. A piece of mail would always have the local post office of the addressee on it. So yeah, that's basically what you look for.
It's almost like a historical document.
True.
Yeah. So what is a cachet exactly?
A cachet can be anything. It can be a rubber stamp cachet. It could be printed cachet. It could be a piece of a newspaper can be used.
It's like an embellishment on the envelope.
It enhances the appearance of the piece of mail.
Okay. And what is the difference between philatelic mail and postal history?
Philatelic mail is a piece of mail where the collector sends a stamped envelope to a ship or a location and asks them to postmark it and to send it back to him. A piece of real mail is a letter mailed from a person that's assigned to a ship or a station, and it's sent to the addressee, and that's more of a love letter from a sailor on the Arizona on December 6th would be a unique find if it got off the ship before it was sunk.
And let's talk about some specific examples. You brought some specific examples along.
True.
The first one I want to talk about, St. Petersburg, Florida, from August of 1932. And I think you mentioned before that when we were talking that this was a very early example of a cachet Coast Guard cutter.
Yes, that piece of mail, the cachet was applied to cover collectors. It was a philatelic piece. And York Bridell, who was the founder of the USCS, he was the person in charge for the St. Petersburg Chamber of Commerce, where collectors basically would send stamped envelopes to him and he would apply a cachet. Now the cachet is on the left-hand side, and basically it celebrates Coast Guard Day,
which is always August 4th.
Which is August 4th, and it was celebrated in 1932. The base at St. Petersburg, Florida, was Coast Guard Section Base Number 21. I believe at that time the Coast Guard might have had 30 bases around the country.
Okay. And so, in effect, this is almost like the very early period of philatelic Coast Guard
Right.
covers.
It's the beginning of the cachet era.
Yeah.
In 1930s was the beginning of the cachet on naval covers.
Our next example is the USS Red Wing. And as I recall, you mentioned like this was originally a minesweeper, but then it was transferred to the Coast Guard?
Yes, the Red Wing was a Navy minesweeper, bird class, for the First World War. And after that, the Red Wing was loaned to the Coast Guard during Prohibition to stop the flow of illicit alcohol into this country.
Oh, and that's sometimes called the Rum War.
It's the Rum War. It's a span of 10 years where the Red Wing spent all her time on the West Coast chasing down the rummers.
Yeah. Between 1924 and 1934.
Right.
Okay. Our next example, let's see. Oh, this looks like it's a so-called penalty envelope. Maybe you should explain what a penalty envelope is.
Penalty envelope is an envelope that is mailed. It's stamped that a private, a member of the crew or a person cannot use it, because if they use it, they have to pay a $300 fine for the use of it. So
it's only for official mail.
It's only for the official mail.
Now, in this particular example, the sender crossed out penalty mail and actually put a stamp on.
True.
So he's not disobeying the law.
No, he's not disobeying the law. Here, the collector used a Treasury Department Coast Guard envelope that he obtained in Washington, D.C., and he sent it to a person down in South Carolina who had cachets made up for the launching of 3 Coast Guard tugs, 110-foot class tugs, and they were all built at Charleston, and they were all launched on the same day, on September 28, 1934. And it's documented by the engineering officer who had this little rubber stamp made up.
You know, I just noticed it has this number 1 cancel. What's that all about?
Basically, that is a duplex canceller. It's a metal canceller. Naval cover collectors, if it was on a ship, would call it a Type 6 cancel. And basically, the number 1 was canceled by the first one of that. They might have 2 or 3 at the post office, but the mail handler canceled it with the number 1 cancel for Charleston at the naval base.
Our next example originated in Hawaii. It's from a Coast Guard ship called the Itasca, which is a 250-foot cutter, and it's named after a lake, Lake Itasca.
Right. The Coast Guard built 10 of these lake-class cutters between 1928 and 1933, and basically they were 250 foot. They were cruising cutters that were assigned to different home ports around the country. This Itasca wound up in the Pacific, being home ported at Honolulu, Hawaii, and she ran out of Honolulu in the Pacific, and basically this cover here has a rubber stamp. It's a mimeograph cachet of its 3rd cruise in that year, 1935. What basically happened was the United States used the Coast Guard, the Navy used the Coast Guard cutters to transport Hawaiian males that had graduated from high school, and they brought them to certain islands in the Pacific to establish stations. Actually, they were colonizing several islands in the Pacific, namely Java Island, Johnson Island, and they were going to use these islands as stopovers for the Pan American Clipper flights that were starting to take place.
Okay. Our next example, where it goes up north, there was a Coast Guard cutter called the Northland. That sounds like a Arctic exploring ship. Or
It was. In fact, she was built in 1927, and basically she was assigned to the West Coast, where the Bering Sea Patrol. That was a Coast Guard patrol that ran from May until November, where the cutters were assigned, and they would visit different ports along the Alaskan coast and go up to Point Barrow. That was the only law and order that they had in Alaska at the time. In fact, they used to even bring back prisoners that were found guilty, and they were sentenced, and they were brought back to the states where they were combined. They were sent to federal prisons.
Because there was no federal prison in Alaska.
There was none.
No. And this is interesting. Apparently, this was sent by somebody named Hahn on the Coast Guard cutter Northland, and it was dropped off at Point Barrow. I noticed he crossed out the word Nome, Alaska, and then it went by dog sled, apparently, to the coast, and must have been picked up by a ship and ended up in Maine.
Right. Basically, inside the cover was a little note from Mr. Hahn to his friend in Boot Bay Harbor, telling him basically that he was going to drop this piece of mail off at Point Barrow. In fact, the letter was dated, I believe, August 3rd, 1938, and he dropped it off at the post office in Barrow from the Northland. Probably the Northland stayed up there a week, and then she left and headed south. And I guess the man or the female that was working the post office in Point Barrow decided to cancel the mail in October and basically send it back to Boot Bay, Maine. And in October, the mail was transported by dog sled to probably one of the coastal ports nearby. I think Wainwright is one. And basically, there it would go on a steamer. From the steamer, it would be taken down to Seattle, Washington, and then go into the main post office, and then head across town, across country, probably by train.
And I guess you could argue that this is an example of real mail. There's no cachet here.
No, this is it was real mail from a friend.
Yeah.
And he wanted to send them, and in fact, if I remember correctly, he said it might arrive around Christmas time, but there's no postmark on the back to tell us when it arrived in Maine.
Now, our next example, it also comes from Alaska. This is postmarked Teller, Alaska. It looks like initially they tried to mail it from the Russian side, from Siberia.
True.
But it wasn't allowed.
No, it wasn't. Apparently, Uncle Joe Stalin frowned upon dropping the American mail in. And basically, this cachet, this cover is unique because it has a rubber stamp cachet from the Northland, and it basically hidden in below the icework is a 1938 USS Northland, and above it, as you can read, it was on the Arctic cruise. And the upper left-hand corner of the cover is a mimeographed marking from the captain of the Northland, explaining that the mail could not be dropped off in Siberia as the intent was, and basically it was dropped off by the Northland in Teller,
I see,
Alaska, where it wound up going back to the addressee who lived in North Carolina.
So this was a 250-foot cruising cutter.
True.
Yeah.
In fact, she eventually became the first warship in the Israeli Navy.
Is that right?
Yeah. After the war, she was bought by a Jewish group that brought immigrants from Bulgaria, Jewish immigrants, to the Palestine.
Wow. Our next example It celebrates Coast Guard Day. It's canceled on August the 4th, and it goes from 1790 to 1940, so that's 150 years.
Right.
And I guess you mentioned when we were talking earlier, you said that it was on August 4th that Alexander Hamilton's legislation finally passed the Congress.
Right, and it authorized the building of 10 cutters to protect the coast of the United States. Actually, they were built to pick up revenue for to stop the illegal smuggling of our forefathers.
And it's got a 3-cent purple Lincoln stamp, and it's canceled or stamped with the receiving stamp from the cutter Modoc.
Yes, if you notice it, basically the 3 cents is the first class rate. At that time, 1940, it only cost 3 cents to mail a letter or a cover. And this one, Mr. Boone of Wilmington printed the cachet, and he brought it over to the Modoc that was tied up at the pier in Wilmington. And because I guess he was friends with somebody aboard the cutter, they used the receiving stamp to cancel the stamp because they didn't have an authorized post office aboard. And they basically, it's used as the receiving stamp was used as a canceller, probably as a favor.
Yeah.
And I would call this more philatelic.
Now, our next example, this is from the Comanche. It's a 165-foot Class A patrol boat.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay.
And then what's unique about this one is basically the cachet cover is actually printed envelopes that was made by Minkus. Minkus was the guy in charge of the stamp department at Gimbel's department store. And Mr. Minkus did 12 different patriotic covers that were sold to collectors. And apparently Mr. Milling in Chicago got a hold of one, and he decided to send it to the cutter Mohawk. And the Mohawk was basically performing duties on the Greenland Patrol at that time. And they also did not have a post office.
Right, right. So just a receiving stamp.
So they applied the receiving stamp that they received it on New Year's Eve, 1941.
On the Comanche.
On the Comanche. And the mail was basically, it was dropped off at Staten Island Post Office, its home port, when she returned from Greenland. So it was
about a month later.
A month later.
Yeah.
And the collector probably got it in around February sometime.
Our next example is from the Storus. And you told me that this is one of a kind. How so?
The Storus is a 215-foot cutter that was authorized to be built just before we got into the war. And basically, they were supposed to build 3. They only built 1 because the Navy was too busy building other ships. And the Storus was built, and she's one of a kind. In fact, she wound up becoming Queen of the Fleet because she was just within the last, I'd say, maybe 2009, she was decommissioned after being over 65 years of age.
It's very interesting. The Storus was built in 1942. This cover was canceled in 1947. But the cachet, if you look in the fine print, was added in 2009. It's many years later.
Yes. Basically, what it was basically this was an uncached cover that a collector had sent to the Storus. And the mail clerk on the Storus in July of 1947 stamped it. The mail was, there's a second cancellation to the right of the Storuses, and that's a U.S. Navy branch 1100 series that was at Thule, Greenland. And so the postman at Greenland also killed the stamp, and basically it went back to Long Beach, California. But then again, some dealer decided to enhance it in 2009, and he put on a fancy computer print of the stories as it appeared in the 1950s. There's only one mistake on it, because the one mistake is he basically called it a lighthouse tender and gave it the designation WAGL. But she was never a lighthouse tender. She was a tender to the 125-foot patrol boats. That was her intent. But she wound up, because of the war, being up on the Greenland Patrol, and she spent her whole time on the Greenland Patrol during the war. In fact, she even assisted in capturing a German vessel that were building weather stations up there for the Germans.
Our next example, it's a polar flight cover. Apparently, this was a Navy airplane that went to the North Pole and returned, but the cover is testified by the captain of the icebreaker West Wind.
Yes, basically this collector, basically, he typed up basically a cachet. If you notice, there's two different types of ribbon. Yeah. One is darker than the other.
Yes.
And they says basically the collector, Mr. Cronin, he typed up what he wanted the cover flown over the North Pole on a particular date, and basically somebody typed in on August 14th.
Yeah.
From North Greenland, Thule, a Navy plane flew over the North Pole, and aboard the flight was the captain of the West Wind. His name was Snedden, Captain Snedden, and he signed the cover, and upon its return, it was put into the mail system at Thule and mailed to the collector in Connecticut.
You have another cover which on the back explains this whole thing.
Basically, that is we used to call them duplicating machines. It was, I guess,
like a mimeograph.
It was a mimeograph.
Yeah.
Aboard the West Wind, somebody decided to make up a mimeograph cachet and apply it to all the requests of mail in August of 1956. And basically, they printed it on the back of the envelope, and the captain signed it, and he sent it to the collector. And on the front of the cover is the corner card, and it was mailed in September on the way home, because the West Wind was home ported at the Brooklyn Navy Yard at that time.
Our next example is from another polar vessel, the East Wind, and it's particularly interesting because it's all full of half-cent stamps. It looks like he used a whole bunch of half-cent stamps to make up the rate.
Yes, he did. And then the mail clerk on the East Wind was one of the 4 winds that were built during the war, and she wound up being assigned basically going on deep freeze operations from 1959 to about 1962. Or I'm sorry, 1967. And basically what happened was the mail clerk, he seen this cover and he says, he canceled it with the legitimate postmark of the East Wind in August. But then again, he got creative and he used their rubber stamp as a canceling device to cancel or to kill the block of 12 half-penny Benjamins.
So in effect, the postal clerk was playing along with the philatelic entry. The postal clerk knew what the collector was after here,
yes.
basically. Another one here This is from the Coast Guard cutter Reliance. I believe it's a 215-foot patrol boat. But what's interesting is this was the day it was commissioned.
Yes. She is the lead ship of the 215 class medium endurance cutters, as they're called now. Yeah. She was originally built as a WPC. About a year later, they changed the classifications to medium endurance cutters, and this was a commissioning cover. The collector probably seen an advertisement in Stamp magazine telling them that they were going to commission this cutter, and for the price of a stamp and an envelope, he could secure a first day cover, and the ship had the cachet made, and that's their corner card. And I would say, venture to guess, there might be several hundreds of them out there.
I want to call your attention to a particularly fascinating cover in your collection. It's from August 4th, 1982, and it was canceled on the Polar Star. And if I'm not mistaken, from my knowledge of Coast Guard history, this is a picture of the Coast Guard ship, the Bear. Tell us a little bit about this cover.
This cover here is basically, it's a unique cover. It's a handmade cover. What it is it was a collector on the West Coast, a Dick Weber from Seattle. He produced at least 13 of these covers. And what he did was he took a photograph that appeared on the front of a Coast Guard publication. It depicts the revenue cutter Bear in the ice in Alaska. And what he did was he reduced it, or had it reduced, and then he did, with his hand lettering, he used this drawing of the bear. It's more of a silhouette drawing of the bear.
Yeah.
And with the lettering, and he made up at least a dozen of these, and he brought them over to the Polar Star, which is home ported in Seattle at Pier 36. In fact, she's still there. And basically, he made these covers and had them canceled. It's a limited edition. But the Bear is a unique vessel.
It was originally for catching seals, right?
Basically, she was a sealer that was built in Scotland in 1874. The Navy purchased it in 1884 to rescue the Greeley expedition that was stuck up in Alaska. Not Alaska, but in Greenland.
Okay.
And basically, the Navy used it to rescue Greeley and several members of his expedition. He came back to New York and basically was unfit for further duty. So they gave it to the Revenue Cutter Service, who used it from 1885 to 1927.
So the Revenue Cutter Service, that's an ancestor of the present-day Coast Guard, they got the handoffs from the Navy.
They got the handoffs from the Navy, and they used her until 1927, and then they built the Northland, which we've shown previously as a replacement for the Bear. And the Bear went on to serve twice, going to Antarctic with Admiral Byrd in 1933 and then 1939. Came back from that expedition, went up on the Greenland patrol until 1944.
And what was the ultimate fate of the Bear?
I believe she was purchased by a guy that wanted to make a restaurant out of it and a museum ship in Philadelphia. But the old Bear decided that she didn't want to go to Philadelphia, so she broke the tow line and she sunk off the coast of Massachusetts in 1963.
Where presumably it's on the bottom of the ocean.
It's now a restaurant for the fishes.
John, I want to thank you for sharing your hobby with us. This has been fascinating.
Thank you, sir. It's been a pleasure.